Hello everyone, this is Video Boy and welcome to LibGDX 2D tutorial episode 16. So today is a long-awaited episode for some of you. Today we're adding support for Android. So yeah, there's quite a few things that are actually involved in doing this, more than I actually thought. So many of you, when you asked the question, I replied, I said, I just assumed it was for the controls. So I would talk about you should put like an overlay on the screen to show the controls, and then you just use like the touch events with gdx.input.getx and .getY and things like that. But there's actually a lot more involved into porting it over to Android, and also just making it overall a better game on desktop version as well. So today we're going to discuss that, and the first thing we need to do, this is going to be a very new concept. First thing we need to do is we need to create a camera, more specifically an orthographic camera. So in the space game class, let's create an orthographic camera, and just call it cam. And we also need to create a stretch viewport. So many of you probably know with LibGDX that there's a lot of different viewports. Some of you don't, that's fine. We might discuss them later on in another episode, maybe in more advanced. Basically, what the camera is going to do is, no matter what the screen size of the person's device or the window that they opened, no matter what the screen size is, the image is always going to stretch to a certain width and height, which is going to be our width and height that we have here. So that's what the viewport does. And the camera is just a good way of controlling what part of the game world that the user sees. So yeah, that's pretty much what they both do. So let's just import them. We'll go into much more detail about especially the camera and the viewports too. We'll go into much more detail in probably another tutorial series, something more advanced, because there's a lot of cool stuff you can do with them. Alright, so we need to initialize them. So to start out, let's initialize the camera. So let's initialize it here. New cam is equal to new orthographic camera. No constructor for it. Misspelled it, of course. Okay, and let's create the viewport. So viewport is equal to new stretch viewport. Stretch. Seriously, how am I doing these typos? Okay, and we're going to use the one that accepts a camera. So for the width, we're going to put width, height, and the camera, we're going to put cam. Okay. And then now we need to actually apply the viewport to the camera. So just type viewport.apply, and by default the camera is a little bit off center, so we need to kind of center it. So the way we do that is cam.position, so we're setting the position of it, and we're setting it to the width, the height, and 0, but it's not really the width and height, it's width and height divided by 2. Okay, and the position won't actually get set until we update the camera. So cam.update. Alright, so two more very important steps, and then we're actually going to be done with this. It's very simple to do. So first thing we need to do, viewport.update. So whenever the screen size changes, we need to tell the viewport that it changes. So we do that. That's it. And now something in the render. So now we need to actually tell the batch how to render and how to stretch the image using what camera and what viewport. So what we do is you do batch.set projection matrix. Now you don't have to worry about this. This stuff is very complicated. Lots of this stuff like projection and transform and all that, even I don't really understand completely just yet. I'm still learning this kind of thing. It's a much more complicated aspect of game development. Basically, for it to take effect, we just need to tell the batch that this is our camera, these are the matrices, and this is how we kind of want you to handle what you're drawing on the screen, so we want you to stretch it. And okay, so that's pretty much done. So one thing we can change here now is in the desktop launcher. When in our first tutorial, I think it was, or maybe the second one, we said set so that the window is not resizable. So if we run the game, so you can see we can't resize. There's no stretch thing. So let's just set that to true, or you can actually just remove this whole line altogether, since it's true by default. Okay, and if we expand, it's kind of ugly, of course. As you can see, our touch events don't work still. We'll fix that later. But yeah, it's pretty ugly, so we need to fix that, of course. Let's just remove that line. It just looks a bit nicer. Actually, for our purposes, we're not really going to fix that, because of course the user's not actually going to stretch the screen like this. The game's going to be played like that. But for the desktop version, I think we'll just set resize to false. Keep it like that. But for the Android one, it's obviously going to resize, and we need it to. Okay, so now let's start actually working on the Android aspect of all this. So thing is, by default, Android, the orientation of the Android app for the game is going to be in landscape. So landscape is like a shorter height and longer width. So it's like when the person turns their phone on the side and they're playing a game from the side. So that's good for most games, but for our game, we're using portrait mode. So the width is shorter than the height. So basically what we need to do is we just need to tell Android that we want the screen orientation to be portrait. And you can actually do it so that it changes. So just say, you know, some apps, if you rotate your device, it'll adjust accordingly. You can do that actually. You just do sensor landscape. So it's going to use your, I believe it's your gyroscope to check what direction your device is in, but we're just not going to do that. We're just going to do portrait. You don't have to deal with all the different directions and stuff. Alright, so technically the game should run on Android, but as many of you may know, on Android you don't have a keyboard, so you can't control with the left and right keys. So the thing we're going to have to add now is actual touch control. So let's go into the main game screen menu, and we're going to change a bit the way how we handle controls. So right now we have our movement code here, and we're checking, is the left key pressed? But we don't really just want to check that now. We want to check if the left key is pressed and if the left button on the screen is being pressed. So the way we're actually going to do the buttons, just to let you guys know, the way we're actually going to do the buttons for this Android app is we're going to do it so that if they're touching the left side of the screen, the ship's going to move left. And if they're touching the right side of the screen, the ship's going to move right. So there's not going to be actual buttons. It's if you touch one side or the other, which is pretty it's pretty good controls for Android. Having like actual buttons isn't a very good idea, for the most part at least. So we're going to change a little bit how it works. So we're going to create a few methods. So these methods will have return types. I don't think we've ever really discussed this, so let's just create the methods for now. Okay, so is right, is left, is just right, and finally is just left. Alright, so when we usually create methods, instead of writing boolean here, we usually write void. And the reason for this is because when we run this method, we don't want it giving back anything. So we just want it to, like, just say for this method, just say we're calling resize for some reason. Usually it's LibGDX that handles it. We don't really need a return value. We don't need something. Usually when you have a return value, it's because you have an algorithm that does a calculation or something, and then it tells you the answer. So you can have a method that calculates factorials with a given integer, and it would return the factorial as an int. But in this case, we're returning a boolean because we want to know if the user is pressing the right key or touching on the right side of the screen. So let's create a return value. So in here, we can actually return a boolean equation. So let's just create it. So gdx.input is key pressed, keys.right. Okay, so if the right key is pressed, or, okay, now we're going to start adding the conditions for the touchscreen. So let's put some brackets because we need actually two conditions in here. So gdx.input.is touched and gdx.input.getX is more than or equal to space game.width divided by 2. And you might be wondering why I'm not using gdx.graphics.getWidth. I'll explain that to you guys afterwards. Okay, so basically this is checking if the right button on the keyboard is pressed or if the right side of the screen is pressed. So there's actually a bracket here you can see at the end of this, because this is checking if the screen is touched and if the pointer is on the right side of the screen, because this doesn't necessarily mean that the screen is touched, because it could be used for a mouse also, like we've shown in past tutorials. Okay, so let's just copy this pretty much throughout each one, and then we just have to modify it. So keys.left and whoops, I believe it's insert. Yeah, that happens sometimes. If you click the insert button, it does this big cursor mode. Okay, left and just right. So is key just pressed? And by the way, someone pointed this out in the comments last episode. I'm sorry, I forgot to check your name before doing this episode, but thank you very much. We had this thing in the last episode where I showed you guys input adapters and everything, but I didn't really have to yet. I kind of wanted to keep that for a more advanced tutorial, but I couldn't find the method call, if you guys remember. So gdx.input.justTouched. I was trying to write is just touched, but it's actually called just touched, that method call. So yeah, that kind of messed me up. Okay, is key just touched? Left and just touched, and we need to turn this so that it changes, so it checks the left side of the screen. Alright, there you go. So now we have these method calls. Actually, we should be making them private because we don't need to access them from outside this class. Okay, so it's going to give us these little warnings saying, oh, it's private, but you're not using it locally, and you should. If not, just remove it. So that's good. It's just making sure that we're not wasting code, but we're actually going to use them now. So let's just write in the conditions here. So is left, and then here the condition for this is just left, and then here if not is right. Okay, and then we do here is right, and then is just right, and not is left. Okay, so that's great. So now we have the controls implemented. So let's actually try it out. So if you see, we go to a different side of the screen, the ship moves accordingly. But if we're on a touch screen, we have no shoot button. And if you guys remember the functionality of this game, just say we go back to using the keyboard now. If you hold down two keys at the same time, the ship's going to lock in that direction. And that's a game mechanic that we kind of want to keep on the Android version. Well, actually the mobile version in general. So how are we supposed to implement this mechanic and still be able to have a shoot button? Because if you think about it, if you're trying to play this right now, you have one hand on one side of the screen and one hand on the other, and they're each clicking on each side. but you'll need a third hand in order to shoot while you're locking position. So this completely messes up our game mechanics. So in order to do this, I just wanted to change the game a little bit, the way it works. So instead of using spacebar to shoot, we're actually going to use, so let's put brackets here. We're actually going to check if right is pressed or left is pressed. So instead of shooting by pressing spacebar or clicking some shoot button, you'll just shoot when you move. And that's kind of neat, I think. And I think that's a pretty good game mechanic. And I think it was kind of what I had planned anyways to do. So yeah, that looks great. And now let's actually do some nice overlay art. So yeah, let's just do that. So if you guys checked in the GitHub, I added some art in the assets folder. Here, controls. You can't really see now, but it's like kind of like a transparent white and then a white border around, and then there's an arrow. So let's actually draw these controls onto the screen so the user can see them. So let's initiate it. And then after this, we just have one last thing, and we're gonna have nice Android support. Okay, so controls, let's initiate it. Oh, actually, I want to add one other thing first. So I want to add a way to check if the game is running on the mobile version. So let's create this global variable here that can be accessed from anywhere. So isMobile is equal to false. So by default, we don't want the game to be running as if it's a mobile game. We want it to be running like it's a desktop or GWT or anything like that game. But let's create a condition in here that checks what device we're actually running on. So the way we do that is gdx.app.getType is equal to application type.android, or because Android is not the only mobile platform, getType is equal to application type.iOS. So if it's Android or iOS, we'll set isMobile to true. So now we can handle the game accordingly. And for testing purposes, we can actually set isMobile to true no matter what, just to see what it would be like if we were running on a mobile device. Okay, so now if space game.isMobile, alright, now we want to set the controls is equal to new texture controls.png. Alright, so if the game's on the mobile version, we'll load the texture. If it's not, we're not going to use a texture anyway, so what's the point in loading it and wasting memory? Okay, now let's just render it. Let's go here and render it. Alright. So if the game's on mobile, so we only want to render this on mobile anyways. Let's create a comment, so let's draw the left side of the screen. So let's set the color to red. Alright, and let's actually draw the image. So .draw, and we're going to use a different constructor than usual, and I'll show you guys why. So controls, x and y is going to be 0. The width is going to be space game dot width divided by 2. Space game dot height, that's the width and height. The source x and the source y are 0, 0. Space game dot width space game dot height, and then flip x and flip y will set false, false. So the reason I'm doing this long constructor instead of just setting the width and height and the x and y, I'm also doing this source x, source y, source width, flip x, flip y. Like, what is all this stuff? Well, all this is just a different method call with more parameters so we can do more stuff. So right now we're not really doing more stuff, but when we're doing the right side, I'll show you guys the image again. When we're doing the right side, we're going to flip on the x-axis so that the arrow is pointing right and not just left. So that's my reason for doing this, so that we just use one image for each side. Okay, and now let's actually just copy this code. Alright, okay, we'll make this blue. And we're going to set it space game.width divided by 2. So we're going to set it at the middle of the screen. The same width, same height, all that. And we're going to flip on the x-axis. And then here, let's good practice to reset the color. Game.batch.setColor color.white. There you go. So let's try it out now. Okay. So it seems I've actually done something wrong. I'm gonna have to check that out. Oh yes, of course. Here, the source width and source width on both. We have to set that. There you go. And okay, so that's all implemented now. So now we need to do some changes to some of the stuff in the game because it really kind of doesn't work very well anymore. So as I showed you guys at the beginning, oops, I'm gonna have to set this back to true for this part of the tutorial. But like, just say we're checking different things like this on the screen. It's not very good practice to just check it directly like that. We actually have to do some more stuff, which we're actually going to cover in the next episode, because if we stretch the screen, this episode's kind of getting longer now. But it doesn't work super well if you look at it. Like, see, we're hovering over play, it's not really working. We're hovering over exit, it's like kind of here. There you go, see, they're like there. So it doesn't really work well. We're going to fix that in the next episode. But for now, no, this episode is getting long. I'll just do that stuff next episode. So thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I kind of showed you guys a little bit how to handle Android controls. And a little bit about cameras and stuff. And also about flipping the images. So that's good as well. And hopefully we'll get the other stuff fixed by next episode. So see you guys then, and have a good one.